It might, friend Michael, but an amputation by such means is not very likely. No, why not? Because, by Jove, I can't say because I don't know, cried Barbican with a quiet smile on his countenance. Oh, what a lot of volumes, cried Arden, could be made out of what we don't know. At present, for instance, observed 1000 Nicholl, I don't know what o'clock it is. 3 o'clock, said Barbican, glancing at his chronometer. No, cried Arden in surprise. Bless us, how rapidly the time passes when we are engaged in scientific conversation. Oof, I'm getting decidedly too learned. I feel as if I had swallowed a library. I feel, observed 1000 Nicholl, as if I had been listening to a lecture on astronomy in the star course. Better stir around a little more, said the Frenchman. Fatigue of body is the best antidote to such severe mental labor as ours. I'll run up the ladder a bit. So saying, he paid another visit to the upper portion of the projectile and remained there a while whistling Malbrouck, whilst his companions amused themselves in looking through the floor window. Arden was coming down the ladder, when his whistling was cut short by a sudden exclamation of surprise. What's the matter? Asked Barbican quickly, as he looked up and saw the Frenchman pointing to something outside the projectile. Approaching the window, Barbican saw with much surprise a sort of flattened bag floating in space, and only a few yards off. It seemed perfectly motionless, and, consequently, the travellers knew that it must be animated by the same ascensional movement as themselves. What on earth can such a concern be, Barbican? Asked Arden, who every now and then liked to ventilate his stock of American slang. Is it one of those particles of meteoric matter you were speaking of just now, caught within the sphere of our projectile's attraction and accompanying us to the moon? What I am surprised at, observed the captain, is that though the specific gravity of that body is far inferior to that of our projectile, it moves with exactly the same velocity. Captain, said Barbican, after a moment's reflection, I know no more what that object is than you do, but I can understand very well why it keeps abreast with the projectile. Very well then, why? Because, my dear Captain, we are moving through a vacuum, and because all bodies fall or move, the same thing with equal velocity through a vacuum, no matter what may be their shape or their specific gravity. It is the air alone that makes a difference of weight. Produce an artificial vacuum in a glass tube, and you will see that all objects, whatever falling through, whether bits of feather or grains of shot, move with precisely the same rapidity. Up here in space, like cause and like effect. Correct, assented 1000 Nicholl. Everything, therefore, that we shall throw out of the projectile is bound to accompany us to the moon. Well, we were smart, cried Arden suddenly. How so, friend Michael? Asked Barbican. Why not have packed the projectile with ever so many useful objects, books, instruments, tools, etc., and fling them out into space once we were fairly started? They would have all followed us safely. Nothing would have been lost, and now I think on it, why not fling ourselves out through the window? Shouldn't we be as safe out there as that bolide? What fun it would be to feel ourselves sustained and upborne in the ether, more highly favoured even than the birds, who must keep on flapping their wings continually to prevent themselves from falling. Very true, my dear boy, observed Barbican, but how could we breathe? It's a fact, exclaimed the Frenchman. Hang the air for spoiling our fun, so we must remain shut up in our projectile. Not a doubt of it. Oh, thunder, roared Arden, suddenly striking his forehead. What ails you? Asked the captain, somewhat surprised. Now I know what that bolide of ours is. Why didn't we think of it before? It is no asteroid, it is no particle of meteoric matter, nor is it a piece of a shattered planet. What is it then? Asked both of his companions in one voice. Satellite's body flying through space. Satellite's body flying through space. It is nothing more or less than the body of the dog that we threw out yesterday. So in fact it was. That shapeless, unrecognizable mass melted, expunged, flat as a bladder under an unexhausted receiver, drained of its air, was poor Satellite's body, flying like a rocket through space, and rising higher and higher in close company with the rapidly ascending projectile. Chapter 7. A high old time. A new phenomenon, therefore, strange but logical, startling but admitting of easy explanation, was now presented to their view, affording a fresh subject for lively discussion. Not that they disputed much about it. They soon agreed on a principle from which they readily deducted the following general law. Every object thrown out of the projectile should partake of the projectile's motion. It should therefore follow the same path, and never cease to move until the projectile itself came to a standstill. But in sober truth, they were at anything but a loss of subjects of warm discussion. As the end of their journey began to approach, their senses became keener and their sensations vivider. Steeled against surprise, they looked for the unexpected, the strange, the startling, and the only thing at which they would have wondered would be to be 5 minutes without having something new to wonder at. Their excited imaginations flew far ahead of the projectile, whose velocity, by the way, began to be retarded very decidedly by this time, though, of course, the travellers had as yet no means to become aware of it. The moon's size on the sky was meantime getting larger and larger. Her apparent distance was growing shorter and shorter, until at last they could almost imagine that by putting their hands out they could nearly touch her. Next morning, December 5th, all were up and dressed at a very early hour. This was to be the last day of their journey, if all calculations were correct. That very night at 12 o'clock, within 19 hours at furthest, at the very moment of full moon, they were to reach her resplendent surface. At that hour was to be completed the most extraordinary journey ever undertaken by man in ancient or modern times. Naturally enough, therefore, they found themselves unable to sleep after 4 o'clock in the morning. Peering upwards through the windows now visibly glittering under the rays of the moon, they spent some very exciting hours in gazing at her slowly enlarging disk and shouting at her with confident and joyful hurrahs. The majestic Queen of the Stars had now risen so high in the spangled heavens that she could hardly rise higher. In a few degrees more, she would reach the exact point of space where her junction with the projectile was to be effected. According to his own observations, Barbicane calculated that they should strike her in the northern hemisphere, where her plains, or seas as they are called, are immense, and her mountains are comparatively rare. This, of course, would be so much the more favourable if, as was to be apprehended, the lunar atmosphere was confined exclusively to the low lands. Besides, as Arden observed, a plain is a more suitable landing place than a mountain. A selenite deposited on the top of Mount Everest or even on Mont Blanc could hardly be considered, in strict language, to have arrived on earth. Not to talk, added 1000 Nicholl, of the comfort of the thing. When you land on a plain, there you are. When you land on a peak or on a steep mountainside, where are you? Tumbling over an embankment with the train going 40 miles an hour would be nothing to it. Therefore, Captain Barbicane, cried the Frenchman, as we should like to appear before the Selenites in full skins, please land us in the snug though unromantic north. We shall have time enough to break our necks in the south. Barbicane made no reply to his companions because a new reflection had begun to trouble him, to talk about which would have done no good. There was certainly something wrong. The projectile was evidently heading towards the northern hemisphere of the moon. What did this prove? Clearly, a deviation resulting from some cause. The bullet, lodged, aimed, and fired with the most careful mathematical precision, had been calculated to reach the very center of the moon's disk. Clearly it was not going to the center now. What could have produced the deviation? This Barbicane could not tell, nor could he even determine its extent, having no points of sight by which to make his observations. For the present, he tried to console himself with the hope that the deviation of the projectile would be followed by no worse consequence than carrying them towards the northern border of the moon, where for several reasons it would be comparatively easier to alight. Carefully avoiding, therefore, the use of any expression which might needlessly alarm his companions, he continued to observe the moon as carefully as he could, hoping every moment to find some grounds for believing that the deviation from the center was only a slight one. He almost shuddered at the thought of what would be their situation if the bullet, missing its aim, should pass the moon and plunge into the interplanetary space beyond it. As he continued to gaze, the moon, instead of presenting the usual flatness of her disk, began decidedly to show a surface somewhat convex. Had the sun been shining on her obliquely, the shadows would have certainly thrown the great mountains into strong relief. The eye could then bury itself deep in the yawning chasms of the craters, and easily follow the cracks, streaks and ridges which stripe, flecker, and bar the immensity of her plains. But for the present all relief was lost in the dazzling glare. The captain could hardly distinguish even those dark spots that impart to the full moon some resemblance to the human face. "Face," cried Arden. "Well, a very fanciful eye may detect a face, though, for the sake of Apollo's beauteous sister, I regret to say, a terribly pockmarked one." The travellers, now evidently approaching the end of their journey, observed the rapidly increasing world above them with newer and greater curiosity every moment, their fancies enkindled at the sight of the new and strange scenes dimly presented to their view. In imagination, they climbed to the summit of this lofty peak. They let themselves down to the abyss of that yawning crater. Here they imagined they saw vast seas hardly kept in their basins by a rarefied atmosphere. There they thought they could trace mighty rivers bearing to vast oceans the tribute of the snowy mountains. In the first promptings of their eager curiosity, they peered greedily into her cavernous depths, and almost expected, amidst the death-like hush of inaudible nature, to surprise some sound from the mystic orb floating up there in eternal silence through a boundless ocean of never-ending vacuum. This last day of their journey left their memories stored with thrilling recollections. They took careful note of the slightest details. As they neared their destination, they felt themselves invaded by a vague, undefined restlessness. But this restlessness would have given way to decided uneasiness if they had known at what a slow rate they were traveling. They would have surely concluded that their present velocity would never be able to take them as far as the neutral point, not to talk of passing it. The reason of such considerable retardation was that by this time the projectile had reached such a great distance from the Earth that it had hardly any weight. But even this weight, such as it was to be diminished still further, and finally, to vanish altogether as soon as the bullet reached the neutral point, where the two attractions, terrestrial and lunar, should counteract each other with new and surprising effects. Notwithstanding the absorbing nature of his observations, Arden never forgot to prepare breakfast with his usual punctuality. It was eaten readily and relished heartily. Nothing could be more exquisite than his calf's foot jelly liquefied and prepared by gas heat, except perhaps his meat biscuits of preserved Texas beef and Southdown mutton. A bottle of Chateau Yquem and another of Clos de Vougeot, both of superlative excellence in quality and flavour, crowned the repast. Their vicinity to the moon and their incessant glancing at her surface did not prevent the travellers from touching each other's glasses merrily and often. Arden took occasion to remark that the lunar vineyards, if any existed, must be magnificent, considering the intense solar heat they continually experienced. Not that he counted on them too confidently, for he told his friends that to provide for the worst he had supplied himself with a few cases of the best vintages of Medoc and the Côte d'Or, of which the bottles, then under discussion, might be taken as very favourable specimens. The Risette and Rignault apparatus for purifying the air worked splendidly, and maintained the atmosphere in a perfectly sanitary condition. Not an atom of carbonic acid could resist the caustic potash, and as for the oxygen, according to 1000 Nicholl's expression, it was a prime number 1. The small quantity of watery vapour enclosed in the projectile did no more harm than serving to temper the dryness of the air. Many a splendid salon in New York, London, or Paris, and many an auditorium, even of theatre, opera house, or academy of music, could be considered its inferior in what concerned its hygienic condition. To keep it in perfect working order, the apparatus should be carefully attended to. This Arden looked on as his own peculiar occupation. He was never tired regulating the tubes, trying the taps, and testing the heat of the gas by the pyrometer. So far everything had worked satisfactorily, and the travellers, following the example of their friend Marston on a previous occasion, began to get so stout that their own mothers would not know them in another month, should their imprisonment last so long. Arden said they all looked so sleek and thriving that he was reminded forcibly of a nice lot of pigs fattening in a pen for a country fair. But how long was this good fortune of theirs going to last? Whenever they took their eyes off the moon, they could not help noticing that they were still attended outside by the spectre of Satellite's corpse and by the other refuse of the projectile. An occasional melancholy howl also attested Diana's recognition of her companion's unhappy fate. The travellers saw with surprise that these waifs still seemed perfectly motionless in space, and kept their respective distances apart as mathematically as if they had been fastened with nails to a stone wall. "I tell you what, dear boys," observed Arden, commenting on this curious phenomenon, "if the concussion had been a little too violent for one of us that night, his survivors would have been seriously embarrassed in trying to get rid of his remains. With no earth to cover him up, no sea to plunge him into, his corpse would never disappear from view, but would pursue us day and night, grim and ghastly like an avenging ghost." "Ah," said the captain, shuddering at the idea. "But by the by, Barbicane," cried the Frenchman, dropping the subject with his usual abruptness, "you have forgotten something else. Why didn't you bring a scaphander and an air pump? I could then venture out of the projectile as readily and as safely as the diver leaves his boat and walks about on the bottom of the river." What fun to float in the midst of that mysterious ether, to steep myself, actually to revel in the pure rays of the glorious sun. I should have ventured out on the very point of the projectile, and there I should have danced and postured and kicked and bobbed and capered in a style that Taglioni never dreamed of. Shouldn't I like to see you? Cried the captain grimly, smiling at the idea. You would not see him long, observed Barbicane quietly. The air confined in his body, freed from external pressure, would burst him like a shell, or like a balloon that suddenly rises to too great a height in the air. A scaphander would have been a fatal gift. Don't regret its absence, friend Michael. Never forget this axiom. As long as we are floating in empty space, the only spot where safety is possible is inside the projectile. The words possible and impossible always grated on Arden's ears. If he had been a lexicographer, he would have rigidly excluded them from his dictionary, both as meaningless and useless. He was preparing an answer for Barbicane when he was cut out by a sudden observation from 1000 Nicholl. See here, friends, cried the captain, this going to the moon is all very well, but how shall we get back? His listeners looked at each other with a surprised and perplexed air. The question, though a very natural one, now appeared to have presented itself to their consideration absolutely for the first time. What do you mean by such a question, Captain? Asked Barbicane in a grave, judicial tone. Mac, my boy, said Arden seriously, don't it strike you as a little out of order to ask how you are to return when you have not got there yet? I don't ask the question with any idea of backing out, observed the captain quietly. As a matter of purely scientific inquiry, I repeat my question, how are we to return? I don't know, replied Barbicane promptly. For my part, said Arden, if I had known how to get back, I should have never come at all. Well, of all the answers, said the captain, lifting his hands and shaking his head. The best under the circumstances, observed Barbicane, and I shall further observe that such a question as yours at present is both useless and uncalled for. On some future occasion, when we shall consider it advisable to return, the question will be in order, and we shall discuss it with all the attention it deserves. Though the Columbiad is at Stony Hill, the projectile will still be in the moon. Much we shall gain by that, a bullet without a gun. The gun we can make, and the powder too, replied Barbicane confidently. Metal and sulphur and charcoal and saltpeter are likely enough to be present in sufficient quantities beneath the moon's surface. Besides, to return is a problem of comparatively easy solution. We should have to overcome the lunar attraction only, a slight matter. The rest of the business would be readily done by gravity. Enough said on the subject, exclaimed Arden curtly. How to get back is indefinitely postponed. How to communicate with our friends on the earth is another matter, and, as it seems to me, an extremely easy one. Let us hear the very easy means by which you propose to communicate with our friends on earth, asked the captain with a sneer, for he was by this time a little out of humour. By means of bolides ejected from the lunar volcanoes, replied the Frenchman without an instant's hesitation. Well said, friend Arden, exclaimed Barbicane. I am quite disposed to acknowledge the feasibility of your plan. Laplace has calculated that a force 5 times greater than that of an ordinary cannon would be sufficient to send a bolide from the moon to the earth. Now there is no cannon that can vie in force with even the smallest volcano. Hurrah, cried Arden, delighted at his success. Just imagine the pleasure of sending our letters postage-free. But oh, what a splendid idea. Dolts that we were for not thinking of it sooner. Let us have the splendid idea, cried the captain with some of his old acrimony. Why didn't we fasten a wire to the projectile? Asked Arden triumphantly. It would have enabled us to exchange telegrams with the earth. Ho, 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 roared the captain, rapidly recovering his good humour. Decidedly the best joke of the season. Ha, 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 of course you have calculated the weight of a wire 240,000 miles long. No matter about its weight, cried the Frenchman impetuously. We should have laughed at its weight. We could have tripled the charge of the Columbiad, we could have quadrupled it. Aye, quintupled it if necessary, he added in tones evidently increasing in loudness and violence. Yes, friend Michael, observed Barbicane, but there is a slight and unfortunately a fatal defect in your project. The earth, by its rotation, would have wrapped our wire around herself, like thread around a spool, and dragged us back almost with the speed of lightning. By the 9 gods of Porcina, cried Arden, something is wrong with my head today. My brain is out of joint, and I am making as nice a mess of things as my friend Marston was ever capable of. By the by, talking of Marston, if we never return to the earth, what is to prevent him from following us to the moon? Nothing, replied Barbicane. He is a faithful friend and a reliable comrade. Besides, what is easier? Is not the Columbiad still at Stony Hill? Cannot gun-cotton be readily manufactured on any occasion? Will not the moon again pass through the zenith of Florida? 18 years from now, will she not occupy exactly the same spot that she does today? Certainly, cried Arden with increasing enthusiasm, Marston will come, and Elphinstone of the Torpedo, and the gallant Bloomsbury and Bilsby the Brave and all our friends of the Baltimore Gun Club, and we shall receive them with all the honors. And then we shall establish projectile trains between the earth and the moon. Hurrah for J.T. Marston! Hurrah for Secretary Marston! Cried the captain with an enthusiasm almost equal to Arden's. Hurrah for my dear friend Marston! Cried Barbicane, hardly less excited than his comrades. Our old acquaintance Marston, of course, could not have heard the joyous acclamations that welcomed his name, but at that moment he certainly must have felt his ears most unaccountably tingling. What was he doing at the time? He was rattling along the banks of the Kansas River, as fast as an express train could take him, on the road to Long's Peak, where, by means of the great telescope, he expected to find some traces of the projectile that contained his friends. He never forgot them for a moment, but of course he little dreamed that his name at that very time was exciting their vividest recollections and their warmest applause. In fact, their recollections were rather too vivid, and their applause decidedly too warm. Was not the animation that prevailed among the guests of the projectile of a very unusual character, and was it not becoming more and more violent every moment? Could the wine have caused it? No, though not teetotalers, they never drank to excess. Could the moon's proximity, shedding her subtle, mysterious influence over their nervous systems, have stimulated them to a degree that was threatening to border on frenzy? Their faces were as red as if they were standing before a hot fire. Their breathing was loud, and their lungs heaved like a smith's bellows. Their eyes blazed like burning coals. Their voices sounded as loud and harsh as that of a stump speaker trying to make himself heard by an inattentive or hostile crowd. Their words popped from their lips like corks from champagne bottles. Their gesticulating became wilder and in fact more alarming, considering the little room left in the projectile for muscular displays of any kind. But the most extraordinary part of the whole phenomenon was that neither of them, not even Barbicane, had the slightest consciousness of any strange or unusual ebullition of spirits either on his own part or on that of the others. "See here, gentlemen," said the captain in a quick, imperious manner. The roughness of his old life on the Mississippi would still break out. "See here, gentlemen, it seems I'm not to know if we are to return from the moon. Well, past that for the present, but there is one thing I must know." "Hear, hear the captain," cried Barbicane, stamping with his foot like an excited fencing master. "There is one thing he must know. I want to know what we're going to do when we get there." He wants to know what we're going to do when we get there. A sensible question. Answer it, Arden. Answer it yourself, Barbicane. You know more about the moon than I do. You know more about it than all the Nasmyths that ever lived. "I'm blessed if I know anything at all about it," cried Barbicane with a joyous laugh. "Ha ha ha, the first Eastern Shore Marylander or any other simpleton you meet in Baltimore knows as much about the moon as I do. Why we're going there I can't tell. What we're going to do when we get there can't tell either. Arden knows all about it. He can tell he's taking us there." "Certainly I can tell. Should I have offered to take you there without a good object in view?" cried Arden, husky with continual roaring. "Answer me that." "No conundrums," cried the captain in a voice sourer and rougher than ever. "Tell us, if you can, in plain English, what the demon we have come here for." "I'll tell you if I feel like it," cried Arden, folding his arms with an aspect of great dignity, "and I'll not tell you if I don't feel like it." "What's that?" cried Barbicane. "You'll not give us an answer when we ask you a reasonable question." "Never," cried Arden with great determination. "I'll never answer a question reasonable or unreasonable unless it is asked in a proper manner." "None of your French airs here," exclaimed 1000 Nicholl, by this time almost completely out of himself between anger and excitement. "I don't know where I am, I don't know where I'm going, I don't know why I'm going. You know all about it, Arden, or at least you think you do. Well then, give me a plain answer to a plain question, or by the 38 states of our glorious Union, I shall know what for." "Listen, Arden," cried Barbicane, grappling with the Frenchman, and with some difficulty restraining him from flying at 1000 Nicholl's throat. "You ought to tell him. It is only your duty. One day you found us both in St. Helena Woods, where we had no more idea of going to the moon than of sailing to the South Pole. There you twisted us both around your finger, and induced us to follow you blindly on the most formidable journey ever undertaken by man. And now you refuse to tell us what it was all for. I don't refuse, dear old Barbican. To you at least I can't refuse anything, cried Arden, seizing his friend's hands and wringing them violently, then letting them go and suddenly starting back. You wish to know, he continued in resounding tones, why we have followed out the grandest idea that ever set a human brain on fire. Why we have undertaken a journey that for length, danger, and novelty, for fascinating, soul-stirring, and delirious sensations, for all that can attract man's burning heart, and satisfy the intensest cravings of his intellect, far surpasses the vividest realities of Dante's passionate dream. Well, I will tell you, it is to annex another world to the new one. It is to take possession of the moon in the name of the United States of America. It is to add a 39th state to the glorious Union. It is to colonize the lunar regions, to cultivate them, to people them, to transport to them some of our wonders of art, science, and industry. It is to civilize the Selenites, unless they are more civilized already than we are ourselves. It is to make them all good republicans, if they are not so already. Provided, of course, that there are Selenites in existence, sneered the captain, now sourer than ever, and in his unaccountable excitement doubly irritating. Who says there are no Selenites? Cried Arden fiercely, with fists clenched and brows contracted. I do, cried 1000 Nicholl stoutly. I deny the existence of anything of the kind, and I denounce everyone that maintains any such whim as a visionary, if not a fool. Arden's reply to this taunt was a desperate facer, which, however, Barbican managed to stop while on its way towards the captain's nose. 1000 Nicholl, seeing himself struck at, immediately assumed such a posture of defence as showed him to be no novice at the business. A battle seemed unavoidable, but even at this trying moment Barbican showed himself equal to the emergency. Stop, you crazy fellows, you ninnyhammers, you overgrown babies, he exclaimed, seizing his companions by the collar and violently swinging them around with his vast strength until they stood back to back. What are you going to fight about? Suppose there are lunarians in the moon. Is that a reason why there should be lunatics in the projectile? But Arden, why do you insist on lunarians? Are we so shiftless that we can't do without them when we get to the moon? I don't insist on them, cried Arden, who submitted to Barbican like a child. Hang the lunarians, certainly we can do without them. What do I care for them? Down with them. Yes, down with the lunarians, cried 1000 Nicholl as spitefully as if he had even the slightest belief in their existence. We shall take possession of the moon ourselves, cried Arden, lunarians or no lunarians. We three shall constitute a republic, cried 1000 Nicholl. I shall be the House, cried Arden. And I the Senate, answered the captain. And Barbican our first president, shrieked the Frenchman. Our first and last, roared 1000 Nicholl. No objections to a third term, yelled Arden. He's welcome to any number of terms he pleases, vociferated 1000 Nicholl. Hurrah for President Barbican of the lunatic, I mean of the lunar republic, screamed Arden. Long may he wave and may his shadow never grow less, shouted Captain 1000 Nicholl, his eyes almost out of their sockets. Then, with voices reminding you of sand fiercely blown against the window panes, the President and the Senate chanted the immortal Yankee Doodle, whilst the House delivered itself of the Marseillaise, in a style which even the wildest Jacobins in Robespierre's day could hardly have surpassed. But long before either song was ended, all three broke out into a dance, wild, insensate, furious, delirious, paroxysmatical. No Orphic festivals on Mount Cithaeron ever raged more wildly. No Bacchic revels on Mount Parnassus were ever more corybantic. Diana, demented by the maddening example, joined in the orgy, howling and barking frantically in her turn, and wildly jumping as high as the ceiling of the projectile. Then came new accessions to the infernal din. Wings suddenly began to flutter, cocks to crow, hens to cluck, and 5 or 6 chickens, managing to escape out of their coop, flew backwards and forwards blindly, with frightened screams, dashing against each other and against the walls of the projectile, and altogether getting up as demoniacal a hullabaloo as could be made by 10,000 bats that you suddenly disturbed in a cavern where they had slept through the winter. Then the three companions, no longer able to withstand the overpowering influence of the mysterious force that mastered them, intoxicated, more than drunk, burned by the air that scorched their organs of respiration, dropped at last and lay flat, motionless, senseless as dabs of clay, on the floor of the projectile. A demoniacal hullabaloo. A demoniacal hullabaloo. Chapter 8. The neutral point. What had taken place? Whence proceeded this strange intoxication whose consequences might have proved so disastrous? A little forgetfulness on Arden's part had done the whole mischief, but fortunately 1,000 Nicholl was able to remedy it in time. After a regular fainting spell several minutes long, the captain was the first man to return to consciousness and the full recovery of his intellectual faculties. His first feelings were far from pleasant. His stomach gnawed him as if he had not eaten for a week, though he had taken breakfast only a few hours before. His eyes were dim, his brain throbbing and his limbs shaking. In short, he presented every symptom usually seen in a man dying of starvation. Picking himself up with much care and difficulty, he roared out to Arden for something to eat. Seeing that the Frenchman was unable or unwilling to respond, he concluded to help himself by beginning first of all to prepare a little tea. To do this, fire was necessary, so to light his lamp he struck a match. But what was his surprise at seeing the sulphur tip of the match blazing with a light so bright and dazzling that his eyes could hardly bear it. Touching it to the gas burner, a stream of light flashed forth equal in its intensity to the flame of an electric lamp. Then he understood it all in an instant. The dazzling glare, his maddened brain, his gnawing stomach, all were now clear as the noonday sun. The oxygen, he cried, and suddenly stooping down and examining the tap of the air apparatus, he saw that it had been only half turned off. Consequently, the air was gradually getting more and more impregnated with this powerful gas, colorless, odorless, tasteless, infinitely precious, but unless when strongly diluted with nitrogen, capable of producing fatal disorders in the human system. Arden, startled by 1,000 Nicholl's question about the means of returning from the moon, had turned the cock only half off. The captain instantly stopped the escape of the oxygen, but not one moment too soon. It had completely saturated the atmosphere. A few minutes more and it would have killed the travelers, not like carbonic acid by smothering them, but by burning them up, as a strong draught burns up the coals in a stove. The oxygen, he cried. The oxygen, he cried. It took nearly an hour for the air to become pure enough to allow the lungs their natural play. Slowly and by degrees, the travelers recovered from their intoxication. They had actually to sleep off the fumes of the oxygen, as a drunkard has to sleep off the effects of his brandy. When Arden learned that he was responsible for the whole trouble, do you think the information disconcerted him? Not a bit of it. On the contrary, he was rather proud of having done something startling, to break the monotony of the journey, and to put a little life, as he said, into old Barbicane and the grim captain, so as to get a little fun out of such grave philosophers. After laughing heartily at the comical figure cut by his two friends capering like crazy students at the closerie des Lilas, he went on moralizing on the incident. For my part, I'm not a bit sorry for having partaken of this fuddling gas. It gives me an idea, dear boys. Would it not be worth some enterprising fellows while to establish a sanatorium provided with oxygen chambers, where people of a debilitated state of health could enjoy a few hours of intensely active existence? There's money in it, as you Americans say. Just suppose balls or parties given in halls where the air would be provided with an extra supply of this enrapturing gas. Or theaters where the atmosphere would be maintained in a highly oxygenated condition. What passion, what fire in the actors, what enthusiasm in the spectators. And carrying the idea a little further, if instead of an assembly or an audience we should oxygenize towns, cities, a whole country, what activity would be infused into the whole people? What new life would electrify a stagnant community? Out of an old used-up nation we could perhaps make a brand new one, and for my part, I know more than one state in old Europe where this oxygen experiment might be attended with a decided advantage, or where at all events it could do no harm. The Frenchman spoke so glibly and gesticulated so earnestly that 1,000 Nicholl once more gravely examined the stopcock, but Barbicane damped his enthusiasm by a single observation. "Friend Michael," said he, "your new and interesting idea we shall discuss at a more favourable opportunity. At present we want to know where all these cocks and hens have come from." "These cocks and hens? Yes." Arden threw a glance of comical bewilderment on half a dozen or so of splendid barnyard fowls that were now beginning to recover from the effects of the oxygen. For an instant he could not utter a word. Then, shrugging his shoulders, he muttered in a low voice. Catastrophe prematurely exploded. What are you going to do with these chickens? Persisted Barbicane. Acclimatize them in the moon, by Jove, what else? Was the ready reply. Why conceal them then? A hoax, a poor hoax, dear President, which proves a miserable failure. I intended to let them loose on the lunar continent at the first favorable opportunity. I often had a good laugh to myself, thinking of your astonishment and the captain's at seeing a lot of American poultry scratching for worms on a lunar dunghill. Ah, wag, jester, incorrigible farceur, cried Barbicane with a smile. You want no nitrous oxide to put a bee in your bonnet. He is always as bad as you and I were for a short time, 1,000 Nicholl under the laughing gas. He's never had a sensible moment in his life. I can't say the same of you, replied Arden. You had at least one sensible moment in all your lives, and that was about an hour ago. Their incessant chattering did not prevent the friends from at once repairing the disorder of the interior of the projectile. Cocks and hens were put back in their cages, but while doing so, the friends were astonished to find that the birds, though good-sized creatures and now pretty fat and plump, hardly felt heavier in their hands than if they had been so many sparrows. This drew their interested attention to a new phenomenon. From the moment they had left the earth, their own weight, and that of the projectile and the objects therein contained, had been undergoing a progressive diminution. They might never be able to ascertain this fact with regard to the projectile, but the moment was now rapidly approaching when the loss of weight would become perfectly sensible, both regarding themselves and the tools and instruments surrounding them. Of course, it is quite clear that this decrease could not be indicated by an ordinary scales, as the weight to balance the object would have lost precisely as much as the object itself. But a spring balance, for instance, in which the tension of the coil is independent of attraction, would have readily given the exact equivalent of the loss. Attraction or weight, according to Newton's well-known law, acting in direct proportion to the mass of the attracting body and in inverse proportion to the square of the distance, this consequence clearly follows. Had the Earth been alone in space, or had the other heavenly bodies been suddenly annihilated, the further from the Earth the projectile would be, the less weight it would have. However, it would never entirely lose its weight, as the terrestrial attraction would have always made itself felt at no matter what distance. But as the Earth is not the only celestial body possessing attraction, it is evident that there may be a point in space where the respective attractions may be entirely annihilated by mutual counteraction. Of this phenomenon, the present instance was a case in point. In a short time, the projectile and its contents would for a few moments be absolutely and completely deprived of all weight whatsoever. The path described by the projectile was evidently a line from the Earth to the Moon averaging somewhat less than 240,000 miles in length. According as the distance between the projectile and the Earth was increasing, the terrestrial attraction was diminishing in the ratio of the square of the distance, and the lunar attraction was augmenting in the same proportion. As before observed, the point was not now far off where, the two attractions counteracting each other, the bullet would actually weigh nothing at all. If the masses of the Earth and the Moon had been equal, this should evidently be found halfway between the two bodies. But by making allowance for the difference of the respective masses, it was easy to calculate that this point would be situated at the 9/10 of the total distance, or, in round numbers, at something less than 216,000 miles from the Earth. At this point, a body that possessed no energy or principle of movement within itself would remain forever, relatively motionless, suspended like Mahomet's coffin, being equally attracted by the two orbs and nothing impelling it in one direction rather than in the other. Now the projectile at this moment was nearing this point. If it reached it, what would be the consequence? To this question 3 answers presented themselves, all possible under the circumstances, but very different in their results. Such was now the state of things, which Barbicane tried to explain to his friends, who, it need hardly be said, listened to his remarks with the most intense interest. How were they to know, they asked him, the precise instant at which the projectile would reach the neutral point? That would be an easy matter, he assured them. It would be at the very moment when both themselves and all the other objects contained in the projectile would be completely free from every operation of the law of gravity. In other words, when everything would cease to have weight. This gradual diminution of the action of gravity, the travellers had been for some time noticing, but they had not yet witnessed its total cessation. But that very morning, about an hour before noon, as the captain was making some little experiment in chemistry, he happened by accident to overturn a glass full of water. What was his surprise at seeing that neither the glass nor the water fell to the floor. Both remained suspended in the air, almost completely motionless. "The prettiest experiment I ever saw," cried Arden. "Let us have more of it." And seizing the bottles, the arms, and the other objects in the projectile, he arranged them around each other in the air with some regard to symmetry and proportion. The different articles, keeping strictly each in its own place, formed a very attractive group wonderful to behold. Diana, placed in the apex of the pyramid, would remind you of those marvelous suspensions in the air performed by Howden, Herman, and a few other first-class wizards. Only being kept in her place without being hampered by invisible strings, the animal rather seemed to enjoy the exhibition, though in all probability she was hardly conscious of anything unusual in her appearance. Our travellers had been fully prepared for such a phenomenon, yet it struck them with as much surprise as if they had never uttered a scientific reason to account for it. They saw that, no longer subject to the ordinary laws of nature, they were now entering the realms of the marvellous. They felt that their bodies were absolutely without weight. Their arms, fully extended, no longer sought their sides. Their heads oscillated unsteadily on their shoulders. Their feet no longer rested on the floor. In their efforts to hold themselves straight, they looked like drunken men trying to maintain the perpendicular. We have all read stories of some men deprived of the power of reflecting light, and of others who could not cast a shadow. But here reality, no fantastic story, showed you men who, through the counteraction of attractive forces, could tell no difference between light substances and heavy substances, and who absolutely had no weight whatever themselves. "Let us take graceful attitudes," cried Arden, "and imagine we are playing tableaux. Let us, for instance, form a grand historical group of the three great goddesses of the 19th century. Barbican will represent Minerva or science, the captain Bellona or war, while I as Mater Natura, the newly born goddess of progress, floating gracefully over you both, extend my hands so, fondly patronizing the one but grandly ordering off the other to the regions of eternal night. More on your toe, captain, your right foot a little higher. Look at Barbican's admirable pose. Now then, prepare to receive orders for a new tableau. Form group A la Jardin Mabille. Presto, change." In an instant our travellers, changing attitudes, formed the new group with tolerable success. Even Barbican, who had been to Paris in his youth, yielding for a moment to the humour of the thing, acted the naïf Anglais to the life. The captain was frisky enough to remind you of a middle-aged Frenchman from the provinces, on a hasty visit to the capital for a few days' fun. Arden was in raptures. "Oh, if Raphael could only see us," he exclaimed in a kind of ecstasy. "He would paint such a picture as would throw all his other masterpieces in the shade." "Knock spots out of the best of them by 50%, cried the captain, gesticulating well enough for l'étudiant, but rather mixing his metaphors. "A group A la Jardin Mabille. A group A la Jardin Mabille." "He should be pretty quick in getting through the job," observed Barbican, the first as usual to recover tranquillity. "As soon as the projectile will have passed the neutral point, in half an hour at longest, lunar attraction will draw us to the moon." "We shall have to crawl on the ceiling then like flies," said Arden. "Not at all," said the captain. "The projectile, having its centre of gravity very low, will turn upside down by degrees." "Upside down," cried Arden. "That will be a nice mess, everything higgledy-piggledy." "No danger, friend Michael," said 1000 Nicholl. "There shall be no disorder whatever, nothing will quit its place. The movement of the projectile will be affected by such slow degrees as to be imperceptible."